13 hours GMT. Welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny faces fresh charges days after being jailed for failing to meet parole conditions due to his poisoning. Joe Biden signals big changes in US foreign policy.
That the days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions, interfering with our elections, cyber attacks, poisoning its citizens are over.
The impact of Hong Kong's new security law on the city's school children. Air pollution adds to human rights concerns ahead of next year's Winter Olympics in Beijing.
Even the slightest change in the air pollution is going to affect our lungs and how we feel when we're racing and training. It would be a big concern for me.
The shadow of COVID-19 appears to be lifting from the Australian Open and the discovery of the world's smallest chameleon. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Hello, I'm Justine Green with the BBC News. A lawyer for the jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has told a Moscow court that the aim of his criminal persecution is to prevent him from standing in parliamentary and presidential elections. Having been jailed for nearly 3 years this week for violating his parole conditions, today Mr. Navalny is facing defamation charges. He denies that his Twitter comments about a TV ad featuring a war veteran amount to slander. There's tight security around the court in Moscow following protests earlier in the week. The EU's foreign policy chief says he told Russia's foreign minister of his deep concern over the Navalny case and appealed for his release. Speaking to reporters in Moscow, Josep Borrell said he told Sergei Lavrov that an investigation must be launched into Mr. Navalny's poisoning. Sarah Rainsford has the details.
The EU's foreign policy chief described the jailing and poisoning of Alexei Navalny as a low point in relations with Russia and said he'd conveyed his deep concern over the case, calling for the opposition politician to be released. But he also said the EU was not currently considering any proposal for new sanctions against Moscow and talked of the need to work together wherever possible. In response, Russia's foreign minister was typically robust. Sanctions would be illegitimate, he said. Alexei Navalny had not been poisoned, and deteriorating relations with Russia would have dire consequences for the EU.
Sarah Rainsford reporting there. The US Senate has voted to approve a budget bill which allows Democrats to move forward with a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus package. Vice President Kamala Harris cast her first deciding vote in her role as Senate President after a 15-hour session dealing with hundreds of amendments known as a vote-a-rama. Under the bill, special rules now allow the Senate to pass President Biden's package without Republican votes if necessary. Congressional Republicans say the proposals are too expensive. They've accused the Democrats of partisanship. The South Korean Trade Minister Yoon Myung-hee has withdrawn her candidacy for the leadership of the World Trade Organization. It opens the way for Nigeria's Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala to become its first woman and its first African Director General. Andrew Walker reports.
The WTO member countries always try to make decisions, including the choice of a Director General, by consensus. There was strong support for the Nigerian candidate, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, but at a meeting in October, the United States, still led by Donald Trump, opposed her, giving its support instead to the Korean. The selection process has, in effect, been suspended during the US election and the subsequent transition. Yoon Myung-hee has now withdrawn, saying she has consulted other countries, including the US. That leaves the Nigerian as the only remaining candidate, although the Biden administration has not indicated whether it would support her.
BBC News. The South Korean government says it signed a deal for the construction of what will be the world's largest offshore wind power complex. The $43 billion wind farm is to be built off the country's southwestern coast and when completed could produce as much electricity as 6 nuclear power stations. Thousands of Indian farmers have held a rally in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh against new agricultural laws in a sign of growing challenge to the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In the past week, several such gatherings have been held outside the main protest sites on the outskirts of the capital, Delhi. The protest has attracted international attention, with celebrities like Rihanna and some Western politicians announcing their support for the farmers. The French military says Swedish troops have joined a new European Special Forces mission fighting Islamist insurgents in Mali. The troops who've joined the Takuba elite force are stationed in a volatile area bordering Niger and Burkina Faso. Estonian and Czech troops have already joined the force as France pushes for more European countries to support its mission in the Sahel. A hotel association in South Sudan says hundreds of South Sudanese politicians have been booted out of hotels over unpaid bills of about $50 million. Some 300 politicians had been living in 18 hotels in the capital Juba for more than 3 years. Here's Mary Harper.
The hotel industry said it had warned the government over the arrears to no avail, so it decided to eject the politicians. One politician complained that the power was cut off in his room and that he wasn't given time to pack. Some say they now have nowhere to go. The government says it's paid some of the bills, but not all of them. South Sudan remains in a state of near perpetual conflict, with 60% of the population facing severe hunger.
Mary Harper there. BBC News.
You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Ritson. Russia's leading opposition figure is back in court just days after being jailed on a separate charge. Alexei Navalny, who returned to Russia this month after recovering from his poisoning by nerve agent last year, is accused of slandering a 90-year-old Second World War veteran. Mr. Navalny's lawyer told the Moscow court that the aim of the criminal prosecution was to prevent his client from standing in parliamentary and presidential elections. Our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford told me about the latest court case.
It's a really extraordinary court hearing because there's a war veteran in his 90s appearing via video link to the court. Mr. Navalny himself in a glass cage inside the court room, and he's being accused of having defamed this veteran by a reference to a video that was made of promoting the changes to the constitution back in the summer, which ultimately boiled down to allowing Vladimir Putin to remain president for another 2 terms. It was a controversial move at the time, and Mr. Navalny, of course, was one of the biggest critics of these amendments. He criticised this video, which the veteran appeared in, and he called all of those people involved in the video. He said they were corrupt lackeys. He said they were traitors and a shame of the country, the shame of the nation. And after that, somebody complained to investigators who then opened a case. So now this veteran is claiming to have been very upset and very offended at the words, saying that it made him ill and that he wanted Mr. Navalny punished, particularly offended apparently at having been called a traitor. Mr. Navalny says he doesn't know this man personally, he never knew him, it was never meant to be personal, but that he stands by his words about the constitutional amendments and about the video itself.
And could Mr. Navalny see himself punished for this?
Well, his lawyers say that the most he would get would be a fine or community service, because the law has been changed to include a prison sentence as a potential. That change to the law. He is, of course, though, already in jail. He was sentenced this week to 2 years and 8 months behind bars for another case, in that case, a fraud case. So difficult to see him doing extra prison time, but certainly it's another case with a very high-profile critic of Mr. Putin up in court.
Sarah Rainsford in Moscow. President Biden has turned his attention from the domestic crises facing the United States to his country's place in the world. And, speaking at the State Department, he left little doubt that it's all change in Washington.
Yesterday, the United States and Russia agreed to extend the New START treaty for 5 years to preserve the only remaining treaty between our countries safeguarding nuclear stability. At the same time, I made it clear to President Putin, in a manner very different from my predecessor, that the days of the United States rolling over in the face of Russia's aggressive actions, interfering with our elections, cyber attacks, poisoning its citizens, are over. We will not hesitate to raise the cost on Russia and defend our vital interest and our people.
So what is the world to make of Joe Biden's worldview? A question for the veteran diplomatic commentator Jonathan Marcus.
Clearly, America's friends, America's allies around the world, liberal democracies will view the new president's vision with great anticipation. Some unease because they know how divided America is still, and they also know the scale of the problems facing President Biden. But that rather nice phrase he used, the rebuilding the muscle of democratic alliances that have atrophied over the past few years due to neglect and, as he put it, abuse. That will be seen very warmly in foreign ministries among friendly nations. The difficulty, of course, is that there is a reticence because nobody knows what America is going to look like in 4 years. America's friends wish Mr. Biden well, but there must always be that lingering desire to hedge their bets, that hesitation that perhaps a kind of Trumpism Mark II might return in 4 years' time.
And Jonathan, there's an inbuilt tension here, isn't there? On the one hand, he says he wants to challenge more authoritarian regimes, but at the same time, he says he wants to work collaboratively with other countries.
Well, indeed. Look, foreign policy is about interests. And I mean, clearly, countries as disparate as China, Russia and the United States have common interests. If you look at dealing with the pandemic, although the pandemic has hardly been a great rallying call among nations, clearly climate change, that's another huge issue at the top of President Biden's agenda. But it is going to be difficult. I mean, you heard there in that clip President Biden talking about the decision to extend the START arms control treaty. That may well be the high point of relations between Russia and Mr. Biden's administration. It could be downhill from here on many of the bilateral issues, human rights and so on. And of course, with China, the relationship is even more complex. I mean, Russia is not really a rival to the United States. China is across a whole range of domains, technological, strategic, scientific, soft power and so on. And China is really the huge, multifaceted challenge of facing President Biden's foreign policy.
Jonathan Marcus. Teachers and children as young as 6 are about to find themselves on the front line of China's tough new security policy in Hong Kong. That's the upshot of new education guidelines issued by the authorities in the former British colony. Let's get more from our Asia Pacific regional editor, Celia Hatton. Celia, this all sounds, on the face of it, draconian. What does it involve?
Well, this is really to address concerns by the authorities, fueled by Beijing, that young people have really been at the forefront of pro-democracy protests that have swept Hong Kong in recent years. And so, yes, these new education guidelines have two main goals. First, they want to teach the law and really instill the focus of this new national security law in children as young as 6, who will be taught to list the 4 crimes that go into that constitute the law, from terrorism to collusion with foreign forces, all the way up to teenagers who will be told to use real-world examples to focus on exactly what constitutes an offense under the law. The law is also going to focus on teachers, and it's going to turn teachers into monitors. They're going to be told to monitor students, and they're going to be forced to report any behavior that they see that really is considered to be dissent now under the new law, any signs of support for the pro-democracy movement, which has been outlawed.
Celia, away from what these changes will mean for children and teachers, how big an impact is this going to have on what remains of Hong Kong's autonomous cultural identity?
Well, it really is attacking one of the things that people in Hong Kong are most proud of, their education system. It's rated consistently as being one of the best in the world. After Hong Kong was handed back to China by the British, Hong Kong really sought to make its education system very, very special. It took away a lot of the exams instituted by the British and tried to get children to use real-world examples in order to broaden their learning. And that's resulted in one of the most high-profile education systems in the world. So now that these guidelines are being imposed on these schools, critics say that's going to breed fear in Hong Kong schools, and it's really going to wipe out what makes them special.
Celia, thank you. Our Asia Pacific regional editor, Celia Hatton. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Justine has the headlines.
A lawyer for Alexei Navalny has told a Moscow court that the latest prosecution of the jailed Russian opposition leader was to prevent him from standing for parliament or president. The European Union foreign policy chief has said concerns over Mr. Navalny had contributed to a new low in relations between the bloc and Russia. And hotels in South Sudan have ejected hundreds of politicians from their rooms in a dispute over $50 million in unpaid bills.
It's currently illegal to leave the UK except for a small number of specific purposes. You certainly aren't allowed to go on holiday, for example, but with new strains of coronavirus threatening the effectiveness of vaccine rollouts, arriving in the UK is about to get harder. People who've recently spent time in high-risk nations will be confined to hotels for 10 days from the 15th of February. The newsroom's Jonathan Savage told me how it's going to work.
Well, Alex, it's going to apply to British and Irish citizens arriving in the UK who visited any of 33 countries that include Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, Portugal and the UAE. Non-UK and Irish citizens, incidentally, who've recently visited those countries are simply not allowed in the UK at the moment. Now, people affected will have to stay in government-approved hotels for 10 days at their own expense. That's probably around $100 a day. Only those who test negative on day 8 will be allowed to leave on day 10. One of the purported benefits of the scheme is to protect against the importation of new variants. Professor Robin Shattuck is an immunologist at Imperial College London.
That's going to be increasingly important as we start to bring down the numbers of infections within the country. At the moment, there's enough infections out there for mutations to be occurring within our own community. And where this type of quarantine has really been effective is in countries where the number of infections are really low.
Not everyone impressed, though, Jonathan.
Yeah, criticism from all sides, really. Some political opponents of the UK government saying the scheme should be extended to all international travellers. There's some in the travel industry say the cost of this would be better spent testing people for coronavirus at airports. And concerns from some in the hotel business that not enough information has come out yet. The British Foreign Minister James Cleverly admits no hotels have signed up to the programme yet, but they're working on it.
The announcement only came out at 1 past midnight this morning, so it's unsurprising that no one has formally signed up to this. But the whole point of this is that we give the hotels notice, because they will need to change the way they operate. We're asking them to do something very different.
So, Jonathan, we heard about Australia. What other countries are using quarantine hotels?
Well, I make it that the UK is the 12th country to do this. Hotel quarantines range from 14 days in the likes of New Zealand and Singapore to just 5 days in the Philippines. If you're going to China, you have to prepare a number of documents before you can even get on the plane, then a 14-day quarantine in a hotel on arrival. Now, in these countries, most, if not all, travellers are included, and not just those travelling from high-risk areas like in the UK scheme. The British government's expecting 1,000 people a day to be placed in quarantine under their scheme.
Jonathan Savage. Human rights groups have called on the Pakistani government to release the father of a well-known activist from jail. Gulalai Ismail fled the country 2 years ago after being accused of anti-state activities, but her parents have faced harassment from the authorities, with her father being taken into custody earlier this week. As our correspondent Secunda Kamani reports, there's growing concern in Pakistan about the authorities targeting dissenters.
Gulalai Ismail had won international acclaim for her work promoting women's rights in Pakistan, but her links to a peaceful movement demanding accountability for human rights abuses committed by the security forces in the north of the country aroused the ire of Pakistan's powerful military. She has sought asylum in the United States, but her elderly parents remain in Pakistan, and despite being well known for their liberal views, are facing terrorism charges. Her father, a retired professor, was taken into custody earlier this week. Gulalai Ismail has said the allegations are absurd and that they are designed to punish her for her activism.
Secunda Kamani in Islamabad. All tennis players and officials who were tested for COVID-19 after a coronavirus scare ahead of next week's Australian Open have returned negative results. They had been forced into isolation after a worker at one of the event's quarantine hotels tested positive. Our correspondent in Melbourne, Shaima Khalil, says the news has dramatically changed the mood ahead of Monday's first-round matches.
It does feel like a very different place today than just 24 hours ago. There is a bit of a buzz about it. I don't know if you can hear, but we're looking at the big screen and already you can hear the umpires. The warm-up games have resumed, much to the delight and the relief of the Australian Open organisers. Players are back on court, getting that much-needed practice ahead of the opening on Monday. And, of course, none of that was happening yesterday. Everything was cancelled because of that COVID-19 positive case of one of the workers in a hotel that is connected to the tournament. The 26-year-old man is now confirmed to have contracted the UK strain of the virus, but no other cases connected to him. And more than 500 players, officials and coaches have now tested negative and are back. We're hearing Serena Williams today speaking about how happy she was that she was back on the courts, that she was playing in front of people, but how different everything feels. And of course it will feel different with all the COVID-19 restrictions. Remember, Australia is in a very good position to hold this event. They've done really, really well in controlling the virus. They're very quick to be in control of any cases that come up like we've seen. But yet you see the fallout, you see the challenges of holding a big international event in the midst of a pandemic play out here in Melbourne Park in the Australian Open. And I think organisers for international events, the Olympics, of course, as you mentioned, are going to be looking here to see what works and what doesn't. So things are looking quite positive. They're looking like they're back on track for that main event on Monday, where we're expecting up to 30,000 spectators here in Melbourne Park.
Shaima Khalil. All the attention has been on the delayed Olympics in Tokyo, but this time next year, the Winter Games in Beijing will be underway. Preparations have been going well despite the pandemic. However, new research from the Chinese capital has shown dangerously high levels of air pollution during the month of February. Human rights groups, meanwhile, have called for a boycott. The World Uyghur Congress described Beijing 2022 as the Genocide Games. Our sports news correspondent Alex Capstick has the details.
The grandiose opening ceremony in 2008. And in 12 months' time, Beijing will be doing it all over again to become the first city to host both the Summer and Winter Olympics. And some of the issues in staging such a high-profile sports event in and around the Chinese capital will sound familiar.
The higher you look, the worse it gets. This is the air that Beijing woke up to this morning.